So now it's time to talk about the terrestrial biomes. Technically, biomes are terrestrial, but the word biome is often used to describe aquatic systems too. A biome is a collection of similar ecosystems found worldwide that are represented by a particular type of climax vegetation and animal infrastructure. Um, Remember now, climate is what determines species distribution, and climate, in turn, is determined by latitude, altitude, and geographic position, which determine your sunlight availability and water availability, etc., and your temperature range. So organisms have to have adaptations which allow them to survive in their climate zones. So there are there's a story for every life form in every system, right? This in the Missouri summers, it gets very hot. Trees have to be adapted to survive 100 plus degree temperatures, and then in the dead of winter, they have to be adapted to survive a lot of times sub-zero temperatures. In deserts, the saguaro cacti, which grows in the desert southwestern United States, uh, its adaptation to survive is it's a giant tree trunk, and it has no leaves. All of its leaves are actually needles to protect itself from animal damage, and so it basically absorbs water after a rainfall like an accordion expanding. And then it may not rain for 3 more years, and the saguaro simply shrinks gradually as the water evaporates out of its body. But there is a range or a limit to what each species can tolerate. That's called tolerance. Each species in an area has a particular tolerance range for climate variations. Tolerance is the range of environmental conditions for which a species is adapted. A lot of people are worried about climate change because when you start pushing areas in terms of climate past what the tolerance limits are for species, the species that are there disappear, and it's going to be a while before new species just pop up in those areas. So, species distribution in general across the globe is determined by tolerances. Um, a species of northern leopard frog may not be able to survive south of Missouri due to the hotter climate, even though it looks a lot like the southern leopard frog found in, southern Missouri. So just because even two animals look similar doesn't mean that they have the same tolerances. It takes a while. You have to actually study an organism for a while to figure out what its tolerances are and why it does what it does. Now, before we dive in to all these biomes, let's just make sure we understand the difference on terrestrial systems, the difference between grassland, savanna, woodland, and forest. Uh, a prairie or a grassland is almost all grasses, but there will be a few trees. And in an aerial photograph, if this was an aerial photograph, that right there is probably a creek drainage, and the trees are growing right along the creek. The reason that this prairie system is almost all grasses is probably rainfall and fire. Uh, the rainfall is probably less than 30 inches of precipitation a year, and fire burns out all the trees. Grasses love fire, but trees don't love fire. So fires don't burn well in drainages, though, where it's wet. So these trees have some protection from fire, but out here there is no protection from fire. Savannas, you'll notice widely spaced trees, and then we have trees in a drainage here. This is a savanna, different than a prairie. Prairies have trees only in drainages for the most part. Savannas have trees scattered throughout the system, widely scattered. Fires tend to burn out all the grasses. Grasses will grow right back. The widely spaced trees, though, usually don't spread fire to each other. So every now and then a tree will burn up, but it usually doesn't get all the trees. A fire won't get all the trees. A woodland usually is a mosaic. You have areas that are really dense and other areas that are like a savanna. This is a woodland. It's a mosaic of clearings and densely packed tree areas. A forest, you're looking at least 90% ground coverage by trees. You can't see the ground from an aerial photograph because the tree canopy is almost complete. There's just a few breaks in the trees. So prairie, savanna, woodland, and forest is found, for example, throughout Missouri. And what makes a prairie, prairies are usually, our areas are usually prairies if they're flat. They get less than 30 inches of rainfall a year. Uh, and fire is allowed to burn through. Savannas, usually more rolling country. Fire likes to burn uphill. So in a savanna, if you have rolling hills, um, the fire usually will burn the ridge tops, but it won't burn the valleys as well. So you can hide some trees in the valleys. Savannas are usually not as flat as prairies. Flat areas burn really well. Hilly areas don't burn as well. The hilltops burn, but not the valleys. Woodlands tend to be hilly areas and are often down in low-lying areas, down in valleys where fire is not as dominant a force. And then forest in Missouri was traditionally only truly found along the great rivers like the Missouri and the Mississippi, and then some of the smaller rivers like the Gasconade, the Osage, and the Merrimack. Uh, Down in the bottomland along those rivers, you have almost complete forest, which means over 90% tree cover over the ground. So now let's start talking about some of the biomes. Tropical rainforest. Let's just go right to the table here. Tropical rainforest temperature is usually 70 to 100 Fahrenheit. The rainfall is usually at least 100 inches. The dew point, which is the temperature where the air is saturated, is usually about 70 or higher. Usually it can be as high as 80, 82. But the soil is usually very poor because of the heavy rain washing the nutrients out. In a rainforest, there are trees with lianas growing on them, which are vines, and epiphytes like orchids, which are rooted right on the side of the tree. Almost most of the animals in a rainforest are arboreal. They live up in the understory and the canopy. The understory is the tree trunk area below the canopy. The canopy is the top leaf area of the forest, which can be well over 150 feet off the ground. The forest floor is usually covered with leaves. So this is a rainforest, and this is a clearing here because you can see this tree has fallen. So a lot of smaller trees are growing up to try to fill in the spot. This is looking at Amazon rainforest from the air, and you'll notice you have almost complete ground cover except on the top of this rocky hill where probably there's almost no soil. And this is what a typical rainforest floor looks like. That it's not jungle. You can walk right through here. And that's because there's not enough light hitting the forest floor to grow lots of plants. And this is pretty typical for rainforest trees. This tree might be 220 to 250 feet high, and the bottom is buttressed with these huge ridges that extend out the sides of the tree trunk. And that's to keep it from falling over in the heavy thunderstorms that they get. This is the understory of a typical rainforest with tree trunks and lianas running up and down. And this is the distribution of rainforests. You've got some in Central America, like Costa Rica. You've got some in South America. You've got some in Africa. And you've got some in Indonesia and Southeast Asia. So rainforest is disappearing because it's being exploited, but it's out there. Some place for you to visit someday. Won't talk about the tropical dry forest right now, but we will talk about savanna. Savanna is like grassland, except that it's got some trees growing on it, usually because the terrain is slightly hilly or the trees are adapted to keep fire from burning up their leaves. Uh, the tropical dry forest is simply a rainforest that has a dry season, so the trees lose their leaves at part of the year. Desert systems. There are tropical deserts and temperate deserts. Tropical deserts are found nearer to the equator, like the Sahara. They have some of the hottest recorded temperatures on Earth. They tend to have very little plant life growing at all because of the inhospitably hot conditions. Temperate deserts, on the other hand, have temperatures that they vary drastically. They can be all the way down to 0 and as high as 120. Temperate deserts, like tropical deserts, have very low rainfall, generally less than 10 inches, and they have very few plants growing. Here's the stats. Temperature in a temperate desert can go 0 to 100. The rainfall is usually 10 inches or less. The dew point's usually less than 50 Fahrenheit, and the soil is actually pretty good in most deserts. They are able to grow crops in the Middle East in the desert, and that's simply because of irrigation. The hottest desert in the world is the Atacama of Chile, South America. It is the hottest, driest desert with less than 1 inch of annual rainfall on average. That's even drier than the Sahara. So this is the hot desert of the Southwest near Petrified Forest National Monument. And this is the desert leading down to the Grand Canyon on, I believe, the South Kaibab Trail. And this is the Bright Angel Trail coming up, very much desert environment. There's a typical desert plant, a prickly pear cactus. And that was the mesa above the Colorado River there. And that is a typical desert scrub environment. This is a saguaro. Saguaros are rare. They only grow in the American Southwest in only the Sonoran Desert. And these are big, fleshy, pleated stems with no leaves, and they are very old. So this person standing there is standing next to essentially a tree with no leaves, and this is looking at a saguaro up close in Las Vegas. So that's desert, very low rainfall. Now let's talk about grasslands. Grasslands are not all grasses, but I'll get to that in a minute. Temperatures in a grassland, like a desert, can go from like 0 to 100. But unlike a desert, where it's usually less than 10 inches of rain, in grasslands you get 10 to 30 inches of rain. If you get much more than 30, you're going to become a woodland or a savanna or a forest. The dew point's usually over 50 Fahrenheit, and the soil is pretty rich and fertile. Grasslands around the world have different names. Here in North America, they're called prairies. In Russia, they're called the steppe. In South America, they're called the pampa. In Africa, it's the savanna, which technically is not a true prairie because it has some trees. And then in Australia, they have the outback. Fire is very important to the maintenance of a grassland. Without fire, most grasslands start to grow lots of woody plants, and that's the problem they're having in Southern California. They have suppressed fire for so long, and so many woody plants have grown that when now they do have a fire, they can't put them out. So uh, grasslands are great places to grow crops, and a lot of grasslands have been taken over with agriculture. This is southern Canada, the grasslands on the flanks of the Rockies. And this is grassland along Glacier National Park. This is grassland or western prairie in Nebraska in the Oglala region. And then this is shortgrass prairie in the late summer, the western prairie. And here this is wheat. It looks like a grassland, but it's actually a giant field of wheat, which is a grass that is going to be um, cultivated and cut. And then this is what the grasslands used to be like in North America. They were covered with buffalo. We had up to as many as 60 million buffalo across the prairie of North America before the settlers killed almost all of them just for the sheer fun of it, which was a sad day in American history. But we still have about 1 million, I think, buffalo across the United States, mostly in the western states. We have a few here in Missouri, not many. And then there's the deciduous forest like we have here in Missouri. This is one of my favorite places here in Missouri. This is Lower Rock Creek. There are 3 students here standing on the edge of an abyss, and that's the creek right there flowing away from us towards what is called the cathedral, which is a dome of rock over here. So deciduous forest, temperate deciduous forest, temperatures like the other two, like desert, like a temperate desert and a grassland, temperature can go 0 to 100. Rainfall is usually more than 30 inches, which is different than the other two. Dew point's usually over 50, and the soil is rich and fertile because of all those leaves that fall in the fall and decompose into some great soil. Fire is an important recycler in forests. The forest floor can become choked with underbrush, and fire tends to clear that out and level the playing field so more plants can grow in. The canopy of a forest is usually not quite complete when it's a temperate forest because of the harsh winters that tend to kill some of the branches in the upper reaches of the temperate forest. Missouri's climax trees are oaks and hickories. Each area in North America has different climax species. As you move north, beech and maple are climax species. This is a typical deciduous forest here in Missouri at Pickle Springs, and this is Pickle Creek in Hawn State Park. This is called a riparian corridor where the trees are very dense along the creek here. This is typical. This is the forest floor of a typical deciduous forest in midsummer. The whole forest floor is covered, and you see lots of tree trunks, very healthy growth of grass. This is bluebells in the spring growing on the forest floor in a bottomland, and that's pretty typical. Missouri's wildflower show and temperate deciduous forests in general have great wildflower shows in the spring before the canopy fills in. And then this is the typical forest floor in a trail area. Note the lack of ground cover here. This is typical for a forest in the summer. It's not a jungle. Bush honeysuckle makes it look like a jungle, but typically it would look like that. And then this is that picture. This is Lower Rock Creek. Uh, and this is in the fall, and the leaves are about to drop from the trees. And this is Rocky Creek, or Rock Creek, flowing away from us down below towards the cathedral, which is this huge dome of rock over here. So that's it for temperate deciduous forest. Fire is something I need to mention. Fire has gotten a bad name, but fires are absolutely essential for nutrient recycling. Ground fires are especially helpful for recycling nutrients. Fire suppression has not been helpful for uh, maintaining the landscapes of North America. A crown fire is bad. Crown fires are fires that burn up all the leaves of trees up in the canopy. Ground fires only burn the stuff that's on the ground. So ground fires do not initiate ecological succession, but crown fires do. Now, this is a ground fire. It's a prescribed burn in progress in one of our national parks. This is the Yellowstone National Park fires in 1988. They were devastating, but see, we had suppressed fire in Yellowstone for over 100 years. And when the fires finally did come in 88, they were lightning fires. The National Park Service decided to let the fires burn. And the trees were all touching each other because of the lack of fire, and they all grew into each other. And the fire literally wiped out uh, tens of thousands of acres of coniferous forest, which initially everybody thought was bad. But now we found that all of the animal populations in the park have gone up because when you burn out the trees, you get more ground vegetation. With more ground vegetation, you can feed more elk, moose, caribou, deer, and all the other animals that people want to see in the park. People don't want to see pine trees. They want to see moose and elk and bison and mountain lions and wolves and whatnot. So this is the fire, the Yellowstone fire above Old Faithful. The wind shifted that day and it spared the lodge, or otherwise the lodge would have burned up. This is a ground fire in Richland Creek Wilderness, Arkansas, when I was there on a hiking trip some number of years ago. It was a wildfire. It got started by lightning, and the National Forest Service was keeping an eye on it. We had no idea it was there. We walked right through it and camped away from it. So fires are important recyclers, and they are necessary commodities in systems if you want to maintain them, especially grasslands. So the taiga, the next biome, temperature ranges from 0 to 100. The taiga is basically coniferous forest. Rainfall is 10 to 30 inches, so it's not as high as deciduous forest. The dew point is usually over 50 in the summer, but less than 0 in the winter. And the soil is often rocky and very poor. This is typical taiga up in the Rocky Mountains. This is Rocky Mountain National Park. That's Mills Lake right there in Glacier Gorge. This is a typical um, uh, taiga or coniferous forest in Rocky Mountain National Park below Ouzel Falls. Coniferous forest includes the oldest trees in the world, the bristlecone pines, and this is on Mount Evans in Colorado. Some of these trees are 2,500 years old. And this is Glacier Gorge again, that you can't see Mills Lake, but that's the coniferous forest there. And this is an area that they allowed to burn. I think it was in the 1970s, the Ouzel fire burned out this section of Rocky Mountain National Park, and you can see all the dead trees laying on the ground that have since fallen over. But new trees are growing in, and fire is important in recycling nutrients back to the soil. And the soil here is very poor, so these rotting trees are going to help the soil and new plants to grow in, and that more ground vegetation's here so that more elk can survive, etc. So the fires are not all bad. And then there's tundra. Tundra is actually found way up in northern Canada or up near the tops of mountains. Temperature is usually about 0 to 50. Rainfall is usually like a desert, 10 inches or less, and most of it's in the form of snow. The dew point in the summer is over 50. In the winter, it's less than 50. It's often less than 0. And the soil is poor and rocky. Permafrost is common in the northern tundras where the soil below 3 feet is frozen solid. Plants can't root more than 3 feet deep, so that's why there's no trees found there, along with the fact that in the wintertime, if you're not covered with snow, you simply dry up and die. So this is the colorful tundra in the Tetons. On one of my hikes, this is Indian paintbrush. It's a really cool flower. And this is that picture I think I've shown you before where I'm standing. This is Indian paintbrush along the trail. And this is the Teton Crest Trail. And that's the Grand Teton back up there. You're looking north in this picture. This is tundra in Rocky Mountain National Park. This has no permafrost, but the conditions are so harsh here that no trees can grow. You're above the tree line. And this is the view off Mount Evans in the Chicago Lakes area, below Mount Evans. And I was a little nervous for my son here. The wind was howling, and if he had lost his footing, he would have blown about 2,000 feet down off the cliff. That would have been really catastrophic. This is Norm, one of my hiking best friend hiking buddy here on that Teton trip, and here we are standing in the tundra again. Tundra is not just for plants. Mountain goats live in the tundra, great climbers. And you do find ground squirrels, which are similar to a prairie dog growing in tundra areas. So tundra is an unusual, harsh condition area where you find very low growing plants. Now, the last of the biomes we're going to talk about in this section is the northwest coniferous forest. And in the northwest coniferous forest, which is the closest thing we have to rainforest here in North America, the temperature is usually about 30 to 80 because you're near the coast. Rainfall is usually over 50 inches. The dew point's usually over 50 Fahrenheit, and the soil's pretty poor. This is the area where the giant sequoias and the redwoods live. This is the home of the redwoods, the sequoias, the western red cedar, and the Douglas fir. And here we are. These are redwood trees growing, and this is a friend of mine's daughter actually walking in the redwood forest. Giant ferns growing in the forest. One of the redwoods that's more than 10 feet in diameter that had been fallen over, so the loggers cut it so we could walk the trail. And you'll notice that it's heavy. There's heavy ground cover in this forest because there's a lot of light coming through the needles of the trees above. That's the typical canopy of a northwest coniferous forest, which can be over 250 feet in height. The tallest tree in the world is in this zone at over 330 feet, apparently, in height. This is the reason why the trees grow to the heights they do. This fog rolls in every night, and that helps to keep the trees hydrated. Um, and the source of the moisture is evaporation off the Pacific Ocean. The Pacific Ocean water evaporates, the air rises up over the trees, and at night then it drops the dew onto the trees. So the northwest coniferous forest is sort of like a rainforest here in North America. It would be wise to kind of look this table over, which is a nice summary of the desert, the tundra, the grassland, the taiga, the temperate, and the tropical rainforest, so that you know what the basic conditions are of each of those biomes. Next, we move on to the aquatic biomes.